All right, James, how has your life been in the past 2 weeks?
The past 2 weeks have been very up and down, very busy. I had exams, and we're now, just a few days from Christmas as we're recording this episode, and so my life has been busy with exams and end of the year projects. I'm currently still at my apartment. I haven't gone home yet. It's the 22nd, so 3 days before Christmas. I'm still at my apartment because I've been working on a project for my research lab. Yeah, December's been busy for me so far.
I've been busy too. We had finals at pretty much the same time. Just wrapping those up, all done now. And it feels very good to be done. I'm sure you feel that way too.
Amen. Yes.
It's been a busy semester. I'm currently out at my apartment on campus, but I will also be going home over the holidays, although I'm not that far away and I will still have access to my on-campus apartment, so I might come and go a little bit. Yeah. I mean, we normally talk about the pandemic, and I think I've said this almost every single time we've talked. It was just like, it's becoming more normal. Even
Absolutely.
though it's crazy and it's starting to feel more normal. I don't think about it as much. I still follow precautions, and my life is drastically different than it was beforehand, but the ways that it is different have started to just become my routine.
Absolutely. Another thing I guess one thing that is notable about my life in the pandemic over the last 2 weeks, because my grandparents are coming to join us for Christmas, and my roommate's exams finished a week before mine, it has now been nearly 2 weeks since I've seen another person. I've just been alone in the apartment here for 2 weeks or so. And my roommate was actually going to come back to visit friends here right before Christmas, and I asked him, hey, if you don't mind, don't come back, because I'm intentionally trying to self-isolate for 2 weeks before I go home to my family.
Yeah.
Which is kind of a weird thing to be doing when you think about it in the scope of my life. But like you're saying, it feels normal to be like, well, of course I would be in an apartment by myself for 2 weeks before I go home for Christmas.
Yeah, or like, let me think. Yesterday I was just thinking, and I passed someone in the hall, and that is the only time I saw a physical, real person. Like, the only time I saw a human being in person that day. I saw some people over Zoom, but passing someone in the hallway was the only time I laid eyes on a physical person in an entire day. And I was just like, it felt normal. Like, it didn't felt, I saw people over Zoom, but just kind of reflecting on that, it was just like, dang, that's really weird. Not even just not interacting with people, but only seeing a person once.
Yeah.
Super weird.
I haven't looked at the numbers recently, but I would imagine that they're as bad as ever. Actually, I'm gonna pull those up right now. Yeah, it's about as bad as it has been for the last month or so. There's been some minor fluctuations, but
yeah, with a dip around Thanksgiving, but again, that was probably due to less testing.
Right. Things are holding steady currently, but they are very bad where they are holding steady.
Yeah, they're steadily bad, but hopefully not getting worse. Although every day is a day that is worse, even if it is steady.
Yes, and it's especially sad now that we do have a vaccine that is beginning to be distributed. A friend of mine's father is a pulmonologist. He works with lung patients who have COVID, and he got the vaccine last week.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of time. If we wait this out for another few months, people will start to get vaccinated. High-risk people will be vaccinated. Life can go back to normal.
The closer we get to having widespread vaccination, the more and more preventable every additional death is. And so a death the month before widespread vaccination reduces things a lot, hopefully, is much, much, much more preventable than a death 6 months ago was.
Mm-hmm.
We do understand things a bit more, and we understand what we have to do to make things less catastrophic. But the next step is just, doing them.
Yep. So that's where we stand on the pandemic. Our session for this week is chosen out of pure personal interest and is
yeah.
a little bit out of character for the podcast as a whole. We've talked before about our Dungeons & Dragons campaign that we're running with some friends over Christmas break, and it's been a blast. It's been a lot of fun.
It's been so good.
We decided we're going to talk to you about Dungeons & Dragons today.
Yeah, which, is a departure from maybe some of the other stuff we've talked about, but it's what's on our minds, like James said. Like, before this Zoom call we're having to record the podcast, we just talked for like an hour about some world-building stuff in
2 hours.
In the game that we're playing. But I will echo what James said, that it's been a blast. And we've been doing it over Zoom with, our friends that are geographically distant from us. And it's been such a great way to connect and have fun, even in the middle of a pandemic.
Yes, and at its core, what Dungeons & Dragons is a way to tell a collective story. I think storytelling is really central to what humans are, whether that is, you enjoy the Marvel Cinematic Universe with your friends and you talk about that story, or you live in a culture where storytelling is important and you sit around meals or the fire and you just tell the community stories. Having common narratives is key to what being human is, and I think Dungeons & Dragons is one of the ways our culture facilitates storytelling together. So it has been a great way to tell a story with our friends as a way that is both a common activity that we can do together and it's just fun.
Yeah, and Dungeons & Dragons and other kind of role-playing games like it are fairly unique in how they work in comparison to all sorts of other games. In that the sky is really the limit with Dungeons & Dragons. It is up to you and your friends how you want to play, what you want to happen, what you want to do. I think it makes it a much more personal experience, whereas I have all sorts of fun playing like Settlers of Catan or other board games or video games or whatever with my friends. But for people who maybe aren't as versed with Dungeons & Dragons, if you're playing it, you create a character that is probably different from yourself in some ways, but if you're playing how we are, very focused on kind of narrative and story, you end up pouring a lot of yourself and your effort and your care and thought into that character. And so how you play that and how you interact with other people is very personal. I was talking with some of our people who play it earlier and just said, even though I'm playing a character who isn't me and talking about a backstory that I made up and that is, fiction, it feels oddly personal and oddly vulnerable to do this with friends. And I think that's what makes it so fun and rewarding. Absolutely.
I guess one good way to understand the game is to take a look at its history. In about 1970, a group of friends on the West Coast, I believe they were in Oregon, but I may be mistaken about that, were part of the wargaming scene. So after World War II, a number of war games like Axis and Allies were published as board games, which is basically if Risk was more strategic than just, you don't just count the numbers of troops, but you have kinds of troops, and how do those interact, and what can they do?
Risk on steroids.
Sort of thing. Absolutely. And probably the most popular current war game is called Warhammer 40,000, or 40K. Coming out of that wargaming community, this group of friends created a war game called Chainmail, and it was a medieval-style war game. And you had little miniatures on a map who were medieval knights and peasant levies and magicians, and you fought each other in this, medieval Tolkien-esque kind of world. And eventually, Chainmail became Dungeons & Dragons, because they were interested in not just fighting with armies, but telling the story of, specific heroes. The idea is you'd create a party of heroes to go out and do things. It was heavily, heavily influenced by the writings of J.R.R. Tolkien, Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, as well as other kind of pulp fantasy novels from the pulp era of the 60s and 70s. And so all of those influences came together to create this game that was Dungeons & Dragons. And it was enormously popular and enormously influential on the culture. For example, Skyrim is just computerized Dungeons & Dragons.
Yeah, if you've ever played Skyrim and haven't played Dungeons & Dragons, very, very similar in that Skyrim, if you don't know, is a video game where you create a character, you go out, and it's an open world. It's probably one of the most well-known open world games, maybe behind Minecraft. Of that you can go and do whatever you want. There is kind of a main campaign that you can follow in Skyrim, but there you can go see side quests, you can go talk to whoever, go to a bunch of different cities in this huge open world. And that's basically what Dungeons and Dragons is, except with Dungeons and Dragons, it doesn't have to all be pre-written like in a video game, and you can get much more into the emotional psychological side of your character versus just what armor they wear and what weapons they use.
Certainly. And so Dungeons and Dragons has come out of the wargaming realm and become a role-playing game. The idea being you create a character who has motivations and a backstory, and you bring a group of characters together into a setting to tell a story. Anybody in the world who isn't one of the players, isn't run by one of the players, anybody in the world, or anything in the world, monsters, terrain, cities, are run by the dungeon master or the game master. And they kind of narrate the story. And then the players are the main characters, the protagonists of the story. And collaboratively you work together to tell the story. And because the world itself is represented by a human who can improvisationally react to what the protagonists do, the sky is the limit, If you decide that you want to, instead of crushing the bandits who are robbing people on the road, if you want to join them and have a rebellion against the king, you can do that. If you want to burn down the city just for fun, go right ahead.
Yeah, or also if you're just walking along a path, I think kind of the bits of flavor that you add to Dungeons and Dragons and your playthrough, it can make it really feel real. And like if you're just walking down the path, strategically, you're walking down a path. There's nothing to do. But are you playing a song on your instrument? Are you talking to your friends? Are you looking for flowers? Those little things that I think what separate Dungeons and Dragons from other games is that they're not strategic. All the time in Dungeons and Dragons, some of the best moments or kind of, I think what is core to Dungeons and Dragons are not the actions that someone takes for strategic reasons, but are the things that you do for the story. If you can do things that are, really good in combat. You can cast a spell or do some really impressive maneuver that is good for a battle or good for making money and is strategic, but much more of the depth from Dungeons and Dragons comes from the choices that you make trying to play your character instead of playing a game.
Yes. And there are certainly still groups who play Dungeons and Dragons like it's a war game. The objective is to be clever enough to beat combat and accumulate lots of money from finding the monster's treasure hoard. And there are people who play Dungeons and Dragons that way and enjoy it. And in that type of setting, your job is to be strategic and is to beat difficult challenges set up by the dungeon master.
Yeah. There's different philosophies, and we're more of the storytelling philosophy.
Certainly. And I think that, like you're saying, that storytelling is valuable because you feel like you really do get to know the characters on a psychological level. And stories are meaningful to humans.
Definitely.
Straight up. We respond well to narratives rather than just, facts or rules or whatever. And having a common story is what makes people come together. The classic example of this is the fact that Arabic in Iran and Arabic in Lebanon and Arabic in Egypt are all very different dialects. But the reason we all call them Arabic is because people in the Arab world have this common history and common identity as being, Muslim, as coming out of the caliphates. They have a common history, a common culture, common stories that bind together people from as far away as Morocco and Pakistan. And even though their language is very different and their cultures are very different, they all call themselves, or could call themselves Arabic, even though they're not in Saudi Arabia, because they have this common story that binds them together.
Yeah, well, and if you want to abstract things enough, as I mentioned in our last episode about productivity, even if you think about your own life, what you think about yourself, what is the reality of the world, it's just a story. And I say that not to make it less valuable. It is a story, and it is the most important story that you're going to tell yourself of what is the story of reality, what is the story of who I am. So in Dungeons and Dragons, we're playing a story out and playing different characters that we came up with. But at least I feel in my everyday life, ultimately what I'm doing is telling myself a story about who is Noah, what has Noah done, what is Noah doing, because that's the story of who I am and what I'm doing. And it's different from Dungeons and Dragons, but I think, the practice I've got in playing a character in a game to build a story has maybe helped me see some other ways where, like, I might do actions in my real life that are about building a story of who I want to be and about what I want my life to look like.
Certainly. Dungeons and Dragons currently has become popular, especially over the last 5 or 6 years, because of the show Critical Role. Dungeon Master Matthew Mercer is a master at his craft, and began streaming his Dungeons and Dragons game. And much like, Supernatural, Critical Role is a beloved TV series that, has just a lot of content out there. And so, why are people engaged with Critical Role? This is a made-up fantasy story played by a bunch of friends in their basement,
Yeah.
But why do people gravitate towards it? Because it's a good story, and the characters have some depth and meaning to them, and people feel like they can connect to the characters or the narrative or the world. And so millions of people tune in to watch them play Dungeons and Dragons because they care about the story.
Yeah, and it's not alone. There are plenty of other real play podcasts and shows out there. I was first really introduced to Dungeons and Dragons listening to the podcast The Adventure Zone by the McElroy brothers, which I highly recommend. But that's another one that is insanely popular, and it's not because it's not because of Dungeons and Dragons. It's not because people are going to see if they can roll the dice right. It's because of the stories and because of the character. Ultimately, it's all about the story.
Mm-hmm. We've talked about in our last episode how we made this podcast because we felt like we needed common activity and productivity to get together and hang out. This Dungeons & Dragons campaign has been an excellent way to connect with friends who we can't see in person and do a thing together and spend time with each other in a way it's really unique and valuable.
Yeah, I definitely feel that, in that I'm not accomplishing anything playing Dungeons & Dragons that is productive.
No.
But it feels so rewarding developing this story. I feel like I am building relationships, and like part of that is I'm actually strengthening the relationships I have with my real life friends, but also my character, whose name is Torin, is building relationships and friendships with the other players and the characters that they have come up with. And even though we're basically just playing a game of make-believe and making friendships between fictional characters that we both came up with, if the fictional character of one of my friends tells me a secret about themselves or reveals part of their backstory to me, I feel like I have grown closer to them, which is really strange and really rewarding and a lot of fun.
Absolutely. There was a time in American history when it was called the Satanic Panic. People were convinced that Dungeons & Dragons was going to turn us into Satan worshippers and, corrupt the minds of the youth. There is still some of that stigma around it, but I found it to be really valuable. It's a great way to, like I said, spend time with people and tell stories. And we've only sacrificed 2 goats so far, so I think we're doing okay. No, we have not sacrificed any goats. Please do not sue us.
At least not any real goats. Some fictional sheep have been sacrificed.
Mm-hmm. That is true. There was a fictional sheep that was sacrificed. That's what we found the value of Dungeons & Dragons to be, is these common narratives. The capacity for humans to tell stories is really incredible, almost limitless. For example, I've talked about my faith some on the podcast before. Historical look at the nature of the Bible is really interesting. Some of the stories in the Bible go back 4,000 years or more. The Bible has only been written down for the last 2,500 years. So, for 1,500 years, oral tradition is what carried the scriptures. And to this day, mainstream Orthodox Jews memorize the whole of the Tanakh. They commit it to memory. And that oral tradition of telling stories about their ancestors, telling stories about Abraham and Moses and David, it's bound the Jewish people together across vastly different cultures and geographies, but this common story that they tell themselves is the foundation for their religion and their culture. I was reading a few weeks ago about oral traditions among the Aboriginal people of Australia. Using geography, there are accurate oral traditions tens of thousands of years old. Aboriginal tribes tell stories of setting up camps on the Great Barrier Reef out in the ocean back when it was land. I mean, 8,000 years ago, the Great Barrier Reef was uncovered land, and the people in Australia still remember the stories of their ancestors camping out there.
Wow.
There's a story from the Aboriginal tribes in Tasmania about a volcanic eruption that forced them to flee. They found the volcano, did radiocarbon dating of the eruption. That eruption happened nearly 40,000 years ago, and they still have a story about it today.
That's crazy. Well, and yeah, I mean, any of the most important kind of cultural things or what people hold closest to them are based on stories. Religions are based on stories, whether they are creation myths or the New Testament or whatever. Mm-hmm. Religion is based on stories, and people hold, like, placing those stories as the center of who they are and the most important thing in the world. Or our country, you know, thinking about the United States or any country, what people hold valuable about that country is in part what it offers them now and what that means to them, but is in part the story. In the United States, part of the value of our values of freedom and equality, part of that are what it offers us into our day-to-day life, but part of that is the story we tell ourselves about why this is a good thing, about why these American values are the right thing, why these are the right values. And because they're a story, that doesn't mean they're less important. In fact, I might argue that stories make things more important, that a story is maybe the most important way that you can look at the world.
Absolutely. I mean, an African-American man in the Bronx and a cattle rancher in Oklahoma and a native Pacific Islander in Hawaii all live in the same country but have very different personal backgrounds, but they all subscribe to the idea of America because they hold common stories. I mean, think about George Washington and the cherry tree, you know, "Father, I cannot tell a lie." That never happened. That's a made-up story. But it reveals what Americans value, honesty, and what Americans all have these common heroes. I think all Americans look up to George Washington to some extent or another, and all value honesty. And so that story that you could probably hear from any one of those three very different people, that same story reveals our common values as a country. That's an important story.
Yeah, most definitely. Well, I think not only our world, you know, we've talked about how kind of, especially in the context of Dungeons and Dragons, we can shape stories, that we create stories with our worldviews, and that our worldviews impact the stories that we make. But I think more so, and maybe we don't think about as often, is that the stories we tell ourselves about the past and the present and the future deeply, deeply impact our worldview. And I think especially when we think about where maybe we as a species or as individuals might go in the future, the story that you tell yourself about how we got to where we are now deeply impacts that. You know, say that you are a very successful person, you know, you've made a lot of money, all the classic things of success, and the story you tell yourself about how you got there is that you got there because, you know, maybe you did or maybe you didn't, but because you worked so hard, you pulled yourself up by your bootstraps, you earned every dime you made. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. But if that's the story you tell about yourself, if you are in the exact same position, but you told yourself the story of, I got here by grace and by blessing, this wealth is a gift, my success is not necessarily all my own, I worked for it, but I was privileged growing up, I had all of these advantages, and the reason why I'm successful now is because I worked hard, but is more so because I have been blessed in my life. You could have the exact same actual events happen to you, but if you have those two different stories about how you got there, I would imagine that you might have a very different idea of what you should be doing with that wealth and where you should be going in the future, and just your outlook on the whole world. You can do the exact same things, but if you tell a different story about them, it's going to deeply impact where you go next.
Absolutely. And even subtle differences in stories can be significant. In American politics, there is a significant number of people who have voted for both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Maybe significant is the wrong word. There are people who have voted for both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And on the surface, they look like exactly the opposite political ideologies. And they're kind of on different ends of the political spectrum, but they're not different ideologies. they're both telling a narrative about American politics that is, you are poor and you are not as successful as your parents, and things are bad in America because another more powerful group is oppressing you. Bernie Sanders says, the wealthy and the powerful with lots of money have kept many Americans poor. Donald Trump says that cultural elites and immigrants from other countries have kept Americans poor, and kept Americans out of the power circles in Washington. And so they're similar stories, but with just slightly different villains, and it makes for incredibly different policy goals, right?
Yeah.
The policies of Bernie Sanders and the policies of Donald Trump are radically different because they're telling different narratives about who the enemy is, even though they've diagnosed the same problem.
Yeah.
Going back to Dungeons & Dragons, the early versions of the game included big, tough guys and scantily clad women, sometimes just naked women were the art for the monsters or the modules or whatever. And it because it was made by a bunch of, well, for lack of a better word, basement-dwelling wargame players, some misogynistic guys. And that was kind of the stories they came out of were pulp fiction. Like, Piers Anthony wrote the book A Spell for Chameleon, which was a 1970s fantasy novel. It's a fairly good novel, except that every named female character shows off her breasts to the protagonist at some point, except his mother. And reading the book now, you're like, this is not the kind of story you want to tell about how men and women interact.
Yikes!
Yeah. But that's the culture in which early versions of Dungeons & Dragons was made. Over this past summer, with racial issues being heavily discussed in the United States, Dungeons & Dragons has multiple races, orcs and elves and dwarves and halflings and humans and stuff.
Yeah.
And there's a long history of, racism in Dungeons & Dragons.
Some races just being innately evil, which
right.
Can be valuable. I get why it existed, because it feels a lot easier to go and kill a bunch of goblins if you know that because they're goblins, they're evil, and so it's okay to kill them. But if you take a, step back and you say, just kind of assuming that and it being a truth of this universe that some races are inherently evil or lesser than others or bad, yikes, that's maybe not the message and the story that we want to be telling.
No, and so it is powerful and it is useful to tell stories, but it is also very important to consider the implications that those stories have. For example, two of the people in our party are playing bisexual characters. And in my mind, when I was making the world, at first I was thinking, this is a medieval style world. Bisexuality is not going to be cool. But then I was thinking more about it, and I was like, there are demon people walking around. Because it's a fantasy world, they can get over bisexuality.
Yeah, well, and also, to go to our campaign, one of the things I like about Dungeons & Dragons is its flexibility, is that we don't really just assume that that there are certain evil races in our campaign, because we get to make the world that we want to play in. And so we can decide that races aren't inherently evil. And to borrow something from the McElroy brothers and their podcast, The Adventure Zone, they've had some episodes where they've talked about how they build their worlds. And in one, they were just talking about how, hey, this is a fantasy world and we can build it how we want. And they've just basically decided, we're going to have conflict in this world between, a group of, I think it was werewolves and vampires, right? And they said, but this conflict, they very clearly set up their world so that this conflict wasn't about race. It wasn't that, the werewolves hated them because they were vampires. It's no, it was like a Romeo and Juliet style family feud. It had nothing to do with that they were vampires and werewolves. And why? Because there's already enough problems with race and gender and sexuality in the real world. And so we can decide that we want to play in a fantasy world where there just isn't. We haven't talked about bisexuality or sexuality being an issue in this world, because I think from what we've decided so far that for the majority of the people in it, it just isn't a thing. It just, in our fantasy that we have built, it was never a problem. We have just decided that we want our world to be a tolerant one, and so thus there it is.
Yes. J.R.R. Tolkien has a fantastic, just an incredible essay called On Fairy Stories, which I recommend all of our listeners go read after listening to our podcast, in which he discusses the value of fantasy stories. And one of the accusations frequently leveled against him, as the writer of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, was that fantasy stories and building fantasy worlds was a form of escapism and avoiding, the real problems of the world, so to speak. And he responded that when we live in a world with problems like our own, escapism and fantasy are not irresponsible, but incredibly important, because they allow us to envision what the world could be like. Tolkien, having seen the horrors of World War I and World War II, wrote Lord of the Rings with the intention of, writing a story where people can come home from war. Or, as an example, Tolkien was an officer in World War I, and there was a clear divide between the upper class and the lower class in Britain's army, and the officers weren't supposed to hang out with the lower class enlisted men. When Tolkien wrote The Hobbits and The Lord of the Rings, Frodo, Merry, and Pippin are upper-class gentry, and Sam is the gardener. He's the low-class one. And in the end, Tolkien got to write a story where this low-class gardener is the hero, and he is the strength that Frodo needs by the end of the story. And Sam, this gardener, is the real hero. And so Tolkien was able to imagine a world without the classism of his native England through a fantasy story, and envision a world in which the gardener is the real hero, not the landed gentry.
Yeah, or like in our campaign, my an example of this is like my character is bisexual. The story of someone struggling with how the world perceives their sexuality, that story has been told a lot of times, and it is an interesting story, and it is an important story, but it's not a story I'm interested in telling in this world. That's not what I'm interested in doing. I'm interested in telling a story where that isn't, where someone's sexuality that isn't heterosexual isn't a thing that they have to struggle with, isn't this societal problem. Because I've heard that story a lot, and it's an important story to tell, but I don't want to tell it this time. I want to explore what it would look like for this character to just be bisexual, and that's just what it is. It isn't this whole thing. It's just who they are, and that's not an issue.
Yeah, and so being able to envision other worlds is, in some ways, escapism. You're thinking about problems that aren't the problems we have here. But that escapism is incredibly valuable because it allows you to envision this world in a different light, envision change. And I think that's one of the incredibly important things about telling stories. I was reading in preparation for this podcast episode about Native American storytelling. There's no role of storyteller in many Native American societies. Anyone can tell a story if they want to, and anyone who will listen to you will listen. Typically, more respected members of the community will get more people to listen to their storytelling, but anyone can tell a story. And these cultures often have common myths or stories that they draw from, and every time you tell the story, you tell it a little bit differently in order to give commentary or opinion on something in the world in front of you. When Westerners encountered native tribes, they tried to write down the real version of the story, the way that the canonized Christian and Jewish scriptures have a real version. But that's not what Native American stories were about. They were often a mechanism for social commentary or opinionating through common narratives, and by giving twists to the narratives and by doing unexpected things with the narratives, or even just by telling an old story again, you could reiterate to the people around you a value or an idea or an opinion that you had about a very current and real decision that the community had to make.
Interesting.
This article I was reading was short on examples, unfortunately, but that's another way that stories are valuable in human society. Yeah,
well, and I think even they're so often a mechanism for teaching and passing on values. Looking at the Christian tradition, even inside the story of Christianity, Jesus is very well known for telling parables, for explaining his lessons and his values by using stories as examples. Or
Absolutely.
I think of parents teaching their children, often either by recounting a story from their own life or analyzing something that happened in the child's life, or just reading them a book or showing them something, a show, or telling a story, is often how morals and values and truths about the world are imparted to children. Because sitting down and cracking open a textbook and being like, hey, this is the right thing to do, here's some bulleted points, like, that's not going to stick. What sticks with people is stories.
Absolutely. I am confident that my parents at times in my life sat me down and said, here are the rules, and just told me what to do. What I mostly remember is narratives they gave me, or I have made, about things I did, things they did, the outcomes. I still remember a time when I was like 5 when I told a lie to my parents and got in trouble for it. And it is that story about myself that means I have the value of honesty. I mean, even today, when I'm tempted to lie about something, I think back to when I was 5 and got punished for lying, and think, no, it's important to be honest. And that it's that story, more than the punishment I received, that makes me value honesty.
Yeah, well, I think that, again, highlights the importance of the stories that we tell about ourselves and about how we fit into the world. People who have been in rough relationships or rough situations, and if that gets framed in their mind as they are the one at fault, this is the problem with victim blaming. It is because it changes the story. If you blame someone for a victim or a survivor of sexual assault or of robbery or whatever, if you blame the victim, it's not that all of a sudden, like, the crime, the bad thing, it's already happened. But the importance of, not blaming victims is in the story, because ultimately, the event has already happened, and what the future looks like is the story and how that event impacts the story that person tells about themselves and about the world. And so by blaming a victim or not blaming a victim, you're not changing the events that happened, but you are changing deeply the story that person tells them about themselves and about the world. Because if they frame the situation in that they were a victim of someone else's action, or that they are at fault, that drastically changes how they perceive themselves in the world. And in the end, that story is what's going to affect them in the long term, most of the time.
Absolutely. Stories are important. And like you were saying, our best teachers know this. I was listening to a sermon a few weeks ago about Jesus' Last Supper. Jesus has seriously ticked off the powers that be in Jerusalem in his time for the story he was telling about who he was and his relation to the world. He was claiming to be God, and people did not like that. That was the story he was telling through his actions. And so when he has the Passover meal with his disciples, the Last Supper, it's kind of an unusual circumstance. In the Jewish cultural mindset, the day begins at sunset. So when the sun goes down on Friday night, from our perspective, that is the beginning of Saturday for the Jewish people. When they take a Saturday Sabbath, it is from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday that you don't work. That is the day. Whereas, we think of the days ending and beginning at midnight. In the Jewish mindset, it's sundown. So when Jesus has his Last Supper, it's not on Thursday, like the Passover meal was supposed to be held. It was late in the evening on Wednesday night, which would be like an American having Thanksgiving dinner at 1 a.m. on Thursday morning, right? Technically it's Thanksgiving Day, but that's not when you usually have it. So Jesus, knowing that he has just hours left with his disciples, he is going to be arrested and executed within the next 24 hours.
Yeah, spoiler alert, he's going to be crucified.
Yes, knowing that he has hours left with his disciples, and he desperately needs to get them to understand the meaning and the value of his death, he doesn't lecture them. He doesn't try to tell them, here's what's going to happen, here's what it means, like he's a theology textbook. He sits them down at a table and has a last meal with them. And this story about this last meal has continued to Christianity up to this day. We still take the Lord's Supper when we gather as Christians, because that story is so much more... that story is what gives us the meaning of Christ's crucifixion, right? What does it mean that Jesus died on the cross? You could say, an aspirational rabbi was executed by the Roman state and the world moved on. But Christians, as a people, don't say that. We say that was the center of history, the most important thing that ever happened. And we express that through telling over and over again the story of that Last Supper with the disciples, because that's how Jesus communicated his death to us. Not through a speech, but through a story. Yeah,
well, we may have even mentioned it before. The whole Bible is a story. I think we may have said before, and we'll probably say it again on future episodes, the Bible's not a rule book. It's not a list of, it's not just a plain list of rights and wrongs and how to live your life. It is ultimately a story from start to finish. It is a story. And that's intentional, and it's not that worse or less concrete than a rule book. It's more persuasive, and it's more realistic almost. I think some people would say, why don't you just have a list of rights and wrongs and rules? Because ultimately, I think humans are not creatures of simple lists of rights and wrongs. We are creatures and species defined by our capability for language and defined by our capability to collaborate with other members of our species. And I think ultimately, when you put groups of people and language together, you get stories.
Yes. Like, I am honest not because I know that lying is morally wrong, but because I have a story about that lying has been bad in my life. It has caused problems. And so being honest is a value I hold because of these stories about myself. Here's another interesting example. You mentioned that stories are what make humans human. You didn't say that explicitly, but that's what I understood. I wanted to nail on that point.
Humans are humans for a lot of reasons, but I took a course about kind of human history, and ultimately one of the most common denominators is language for what makes humans human. And so I think that an easy argument can be made for language is what makes humans human. And if you want to take one, there is a very, very direct line from language to stories.
Linguistic determinism is a fascinating concept.
Oh my gosh, it's crazy.
We should probably take a whole podcast episode to talk about linguistic determinism. But basically, the language you use determines how you view the world. Language is how humans interact with the world. Schizophrenia, for example, is a horrible, awful disease. And one of its interesting effects is that you have a breakdown of reality. You get delusions and hallucinations. You believe false things and you see false things. So you lose touch with reality when you have schizophrenia. You also lose touch with your language. People with schizophrenia often have difficulty understanding or producing language. Neurologically, we don't necessarily see how those are connected. Psychologically, it makes perfect sense because how humans interact with the world is language. And so when your language breaks down from schizophrenia, your connection to the very world itself also breaks down. Telling stories isn't just floof. That's how humans interact with the world around us.
Yeah. The classic example, kind of the popular example of linguistic determinism is that of perception of color, and that people who speak languages that more narrowly delineate between shades of color.
Like how Russian has 8 different words for different shades of blue, and they're different words. It's not just light blue, dark blue. There are 8 different words for blue in Russian.
Yeah. And this is not just kind of people who speak Russian have more words for... No, there's scientific studies where people who speak these languages are better at differentiating these colors. If you give someone who speaks, on average, a language with these more words for blue, a palette of blues that vary very minutely in their shade, and you give that same palette to someone who doesn't speak that language, on average, the person who has more words for blue is going to be able to pick out more different shades. So they might say, oh, there's 6 different shades of blue in this picture, whereas someone else might say, oh, there are only 3. And it's not that they just don't have, they cannot see the differences between those shades, whereas someone who has the other words can see the differences between those shades, which is wild, that the way that the languages that you know and the languages that you are raised with have influenced, your brain enough to the point that it literally changes how you see the world.
Mm-hmm. There's a very unique and unusual language in the Amazon basin that does not have a past or future tense. They only speak in the present tense. Missionaries went to this tribe and tried to teach them about Jesus. They refused to listen to the missionaries because missionaries had to speak in the past tense about Jesus. They translated the Gospel of Mark into this language, and the tribe said that if Mark came and spoke to them, they'd probably believe Mark. But they didn't believe the missionaries because they were speaking about things that happened in the past, and so they couldn't be accurate. Because they had no past tense. They had no way of keeping track of the past. They tried to teach this tribe agriculture, and the agriculture often failed. One of the hypotheses is that they just didn't have a concept for a future harvest. They didn't see how this would benefit them in the future because they didn't have language to talk about the future. They only had present tense. Now, the studies of this tribe are rather narrow and disputed, but that's an example of how language directly influences how you interact with the world. And so stories and language are incredibly important.
Breaking out of actual language and getting more back to the core of stories, the idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy, like the psychological concept of that, a self-fulfilling prophecy is basically, if you tell yourself you're going to fail, you're going to fail. If you don't expect that you will succeed in something or whatever, if you expect that when you get on that train that you are going to have a panic attack, it's much more likely that you're going to have a panic attack than if you expect that you're not going to. Now, self-fulfilling prophecy, very important to note, not the only cause for things. You can be certain that you're not going to have a panic attack when you get on the train, and you still might have one. So this is not saying that you can think your way out of psychological things, because often you cannot. But there are some cases where you can, if you tell yourself the story that you are going to fail or that you are going to be anxious or whatever, if you tell this story, it's going to come true because you are already assuming that it is. And that's purely a story you're telling yourself impacting how the world plays out. Because ultimately, your life is a story. And so if you tell yourself the story that you are going to go and you're going to fail, well, your brain is going to try and fulfill the story you're telling yourself about it. And so there you go. Then you fail because you told yourself that you were going to. It's not always the case, but there are examples of this coming up. And I think it boils down to stories. Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the things we love about Dungeons & Dragons is we have this opportunity to tell new and interesting stories with our friends. It brings us together. It allows us to imagine a world where things are different, and then to use that story that we've made to make commentary about our own lives and the world around us.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, it's a whole lot of fun and a great way to bond with our friends.
Absolutely.
And an interesting insight, moreover from like what we talked about is just how important stories are. Both the stories we tell about, ourselves and the world, and about where we're going. I think every aspect of our life, our relationships are defined by the stories we tell ourselves about that relationship. How we view ourselves are about stories. How we view the most important things in the world are the stories that we tell about reality, about religion, or about morals, or the political decisions we make. It seems more and more are less defined by policy and are more defined by the stories we tell ourselves about the world and about the candidates that we are supporting.
I would contend that we never made decisions based on policy, and we always have made decisions based on stories. The whole of the Cold War was a narrative that we had to defeat the Russians. Why were the United States and the Soviet Union enemies? We could have been allies.
I think you're definitely right. I think that our stories have become more different. I think we have, I think humans have always been defined by our stories, from 10,000 years ago till now. But I think in American politics is what's happening is our stories are becoming so different that they are becoming irreconcilable. They are not different versions of the same story. They are becoming simply different stories.
Yes, I'd agree with that.
If you just have different versions of the story, like I think was more common, 20 years ago, you can still say, hey, we're all Americans here. We have slightly different visions of the future. We have different stories, but I can, see a lot of the similarities. Whereas it's getting more to the point where if you line our stories up next to each other, there are plenty of people who their stories are just simply irreconcilable with each other, that they just contain different facts, different truths, different stories about reality. Take the election. If you say that Joe Biden won, or if you say that Donald Trump won, those stories are just, the binary opposites of each other. And so I think that our stories have been diverging to the point where they are just different stories.
Yeah. So absolutely. Understanding how we interact with stories in the world is incredibly important.
It's incredibly human, and therefore, of course, it's going to be important.
That's what we have for this week, folks. We hope that you have found our discussion of Dungeons & Dragons and stories as humans interesting. Shoot us an email if you want to hear more about our Dungeons & Dragons campaign. It's almost a stereotype that people who play Dungeons & Dragons can't talk about anything else, because they are really cool stories. But if you do want to hear, we'd be happy to do a special episode telling that story. Yeah, and highly recommend that if you have friends who are interested, or maybe not, try out Dungeons & Dragons for yourself, or if you want to listen to what it's like, Critical Role, or I highly recommend the Adventure Zone podcasts, a lot of fun, and just
be intentional. Think about the stories you're telling yourself and about the world, because as we've, I think, made clear, we think they're pretty dang important.
Thank you, and we'll see you again in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Take care.